He knew he was too deep, but it was already too late. 5 kilometers northwest of Dolly's Cay in the Bahamas, the reef breaks open into a wound of impossible blue. From the surface, it looks calm, inviting, almost harmless. Divers call it the Four Sharks Blue Hole. But beneath that tranquil circle lies one of the largest underwater cavern systems in the region. If you descend far enough and push past the main chamber, the cave narrows. Rock presses in, light disappears. At the very back, a thin crack splits the stone, leading into a vast chamber so remote it feels unfinished by the world above. In 1997, 2 men entered the uncharted section of the cave. No maps, no precedent, no margin for error. What happened next turned one of the Bahamas' most beautiful dive sites into a place divers still speak of in lowered voices. Dark greetings, I am Lord Freakzilla, and this is Gothic Sagas. Just after 8 o'clock on the evening of August 17, 1997, Rob Parker and Dan Malone, known to everyone as Duffer, sat on the edge of a small boat drifting 3 miles off the coast of Dolly's Cay in the Bahamas. The sea was quiet. A few final adjustments, a glance between them, a nod, then almost in perfect sync, they fell backward into the dark water. Within minutes, Rob and Duffer, accompanied by 2 support divers, began their descent into the Four Sharks Blue Hole. For them, this was routine, another dive among the thousands already etched into their careers. They were experts, all of them. But Rob stood apart. At just 35 years old, he was already regarded as one of the finest cave divers in the world, and unquestionably the best in the United Kingdom. His reputation had been sealed years earlier after a record-setting dive to 206 feet inside the England's Wookiee Hole. That descent would remain unmatched for 2 decades, a benchmark no one could touch. This dive wasn't meant to break records. It wasn't a challenge or a test. It was a pleasure dive. But business, not curiosity, was what had brought them to the Bahamas in the first place. They were part of a larger expedition, a team being followed by a German television crew documenting the world's most dangerous blue holes. Rob Parker was not meant to be there. He had joined late, after a position on the team opened under tragic circumstances. 4 months earlier, one of their closest friends, and one of the most respected figures in technical and cave diving, Rob Palmer, had been killed while diving a blue hole in the Red Sea. Palmer had been in Egypt attending a technical diving conference. During a break, he and several other experienced divers planned what was meant to be a straightforward wall dive. The idea was simple: descend along the rock face and observe the marine life clinging to the reef. Nothing extreme, nothing experimental. But the moment Palmer entered the water, something was wrong. Instead of swimming toward the wall with the others, he began to sink, fast. Divers pursued him, pushing deeper and deeper, chasing his silhouette through the dark until their depth gauges crept past 325 feet. At that point, they had no choice but to stop. They were already far beyond the limits of their equipment. To go any deeper would have meant joining him. Palmer disappeared into the blue, and 4 months later, his absence was the reason Rob Parker was now sitting on the edge of the boat in the Bahamas, preparing to descend into another blue hole. History, it seemed, had a way of circling back. Palmer was falling far too fast for anyone to reach him. Within seconds, he slipped beyond sight, dropping into the depths so extreme that recovery was impossible. His body was never found. To this day, no one knows exactly what caused him to descend so rapidly. The prevailing theory is that he suffered a sudden medical event, possibly a heart attack, or loss of consciousness, moments after entering the water. Without control, he simply sank, carried downwards by gravity and the open blue beneath him. In the months before his death, Palmer had been one of several elite divers already being filmed for that same German television documentary on blue holes. After his loss, the project briefly hung in uncertainty, but eventually a decision was made to continue. If nothing else, the film would be finished in Palmer's honor, and so Rob Parker was asked to take his place. He didn't hesitate. Rob and Duffer had arrived in the Bahamas 2 weeks earlier, and the documentary schedule was relentless. Every day meant another dive, another descent, another camera angle. The divers were safe, controlled, predictable, and that was the problem. Rob Parker had never built his life around the ordinary. From the beginning, he chased limits, not comfort. Too many routine dives left him restless. pacing inside his own skin. Duffer knew him better than anyone. He also knew there was only one cure for Rob's growing impatience, a dive that actually felt alive. But that kind of dive couldn't be cleared. Their plan to explore deeper into the Four Sharks blue hole would never survive a conversation with the film crew, and it certainly wouldn't pass the documentary's insurance company. The risk was obvious, even to divers of their experience. So it became a quiet agreement, an off-the-books descent. As long as they were back before the crew returned that evening to collect more footage, no one would ask questions, no one would need to know, and the danger of Four Sharks had nothing to do with sharks at all. It came from what blue holes always offer so freely: depth without mercy, and a direct path into the unknown. If you're unfamiliar with blue holes, they're underwater sinkholes formed during the ice ages, when sea levels were far lower than they are today. As oceans rose, these vast voids flooded, leaving behind vertical shafts that plunged straight down into darkness. They exist throughout the world's oceans, but the waters surrounding the Bahamas are especially dense with them. Four Sharks Blue Hole was one of those discoveries, first located by Rob Palmer himself, which is why the site was chosen for the documentary. No one knows how many blue holes exist worldwide. New ones are still being found, and each discovery, our understanding of them continues to shift. One thing, however, is certain: they're deep. The deepest known blue hole on Earth, the Dragon Hole in the South China Sea, drops nearly 1,000 feet to the bottom. It wasn't even discovered until the last decade. The second deepest, reaching roughly 900 feet, was identified off the coast of Mexico in 2023. Ask a diver what makes blue holes so dangerous, and you're unlikely to get the same answer twice. That's because there isn't a single threat waiting inside them. There are many. The first danger of a blue hole is the most obvious: depth. Any uncontrolled descent like the one that claimed Rob Palmer can become irreversible within seconds. Many blue holes extend far beyond depths where the human body can survive. Once a diver slips past certain limits, there's no rescue, there's only pressure. But depth is the only beginning. Some blue holes are sealed, vertical caves, straight shafts with little to no water circulation. Others branch outward, connecting to distant cave systems or even the open ocean. In those cases, shifting tides can transform them into underwater funnels, pulling water violently inward or forcing it back out without warning. To avoid this, dives must be timed precisely with slack tide, the brief window when the water goes still. That timing was the reason Rob and Duffer entered the water at 8 o'clock that night. And yet, even with all this, opinions differ. Some members of the diving community argue that blue holes aren't inherently more dangerous than any other dive. According to them, it isn't the environment that kills divers. It's the moment a diver goes beyond their limits. A line that sounds reasonable, right up until something goes wrong. By the time Rob reached the Bahamas, the dives he had completed were among the first blue holes he had explored since the 1980s. But when he learned that Four Sharks contained the largest known underwater cavern in the country, something clicked. Even more enticing was what waited at the far end of the cavern: a massive back wall, split by a narrow crack no diver had ever dared to pass through. For Rob Parker, that was an invitation. His reputation had been built on going where others stopped, not out of bravado, but out of curiosity and resolve. Long before the water claimed him, Rob was an exceptional, self-taught rock and mountain climber. He led expeditions into caves around the world that had never been entered, let alone mapped. Diving just happened to be the medium where his abilities converged. Even early in his career, it was obvious to those around him that Rob was different. One of those people was Sheck Exley, widely regarded as the architect of modern cave diving. Exley once remarked that if Rob had been born in Florida, surrounded by cave systems instead of England's limited sites, he would have rapidly become the world's leading underwater explorer. Despite the geography, Rob was already on that path, and Four Sharks was exactly the kind of place that had made his name. There was no challenge on Earth that ever seemed difficult enough for Rob. Even in extreme environments, everything came too easily. When the world failed to test him, he invented tests of his own. Anyone who spent time around Rob knew how this usually began: a casual suggestion, a smile, and soon enough, someone found themselves competing with him, usually before realizing that saying yes had been a mistake. It never took long for that realization to arrive. On one expedition, Rob challenged the team to a push-up contest in 104-degree heat. One by one, everyone dropped out. Some managed hundreds. Rob did more than all of them. The next day, the challengers could barely move. Rob looked unchanged. If anything, he seemed stronger. On another occasion, at Wakulla Springs in Florida, he talked a group into a pull-up contest on a diving tower. Only one diver managed to keep pace with him and even match Rob's final count. but the effort drained everything he had left. Unable to haul himself back onto the platform, as Rob had done effortlessly, the diver let go and fell 26 feet into the water below. Rob climbed back up without comment. Stories like this followed him everywhere, not because he bragged about them, but because people kept learning again and again just how far beyond ordinary limits he really was. But for all his intensity, Rob approached the things he loved with a lightness that surprised people. There was an almost childlike excitement in him, a genuine joy that never seemed to fade, no matter how extreme the environment. In 1983, at just 21 years old, Rob was selected to assist a film project in Mexico. What was supposed to be a 4-month assignment quickly became something much bigger. The expedition roster read like a Hall of Fame for extreme adventure sports, led by legendary cave explorer Bill Stone. When Rob first arrived, Bill took an immediate liking to him, but assumed he was simply an eager rookie, someone who would need close supervision. That impression didn't last long. Once Bill saw Rob in his element, handling equipment, navigating terrain, adapting without hesitation, it became clear he wasn't just capable, he was exceptional. And despite his appetite for extreme challenges, Rob was a model teammate, easy to work with, impossible not to like. His presence lifted the group rather than weighted it down. That became clear within the first few days of the Mexico expedition, when the truck carrying the team's equipment broke down in the middle of nowhere. The diver managed to arrange for replacement parts, but it was clear they wouldn't arrive anytime soon. The delay settled over the team like a fog, draining momentum and souring the mood. Rob noticed immediately. Without a word, he grabbed a length of rope, climbed into the trees, and began rigging a Tyrolean line, a long improvised run not unlike a zip line. When he finished, it stretched more than 300 feet through the jungle. The effect was instant. Within minutes, a group of elite explorers and scientists were laughing like children at recess, lining up for turns. Some were still riding the line when the truck was finally repaired and ready to move on. That was Rob's gift. He didn't just push limits, he lifted people with him. Early in his career, Rob's name became nearly interchangeable with one word: fearless. Friends, colleagues, teammates all reached for it instinctively. But fearlessness, like perfection, doesn't really exist. No one moves through the world without fear, not even someone as accomplished as Rob. And that raises a question. What could possibly frighten a cave diving prodigy who climbed Everest, taught himself extreme technical rock climbing, and filmed sharks at arm's length without a cage? The answer wasn't depth, it wasn't danger. It was something far closer than that. The answer, strangely enough, was peas. Not a dislike, not a mild aversion. A documented, corroborated, and very real phobia. No one knows how it started or why it took hold, only that Rob went to great lengths to keep it hidden. For a long time, he succeeded. But secrecy has limits, and all it took was one dinner and a single pea within reach for the truth to surface. At first, his colleagues thought it was a joke, a performance, something exaggerated for a laugh. But when it became clear that Rob wasn't playing along, disbelief gave way to stunned silence, and then, inevitably, to opportunity. For a group of people who were usually outmatched by Rob in nearly every physical challenge, this was priceless information. They hadn't found a weakness, they found the weakness. From that point on, whenever Rob wasn't present, the debates began. Was the fear genuine? How severe was it? Could it be triggered reliably? They were scientists, after all, and scientists don't settle questions like this with speculation, they test. And so, for years, Rob became their unwitting test subject. They hid sauteed peas, powdered peas, pureed peas, canned peas. Any form they could get their hands on found its way into his meals, his backpack, his gear. Each time they watched closely, waiting for the moment it revealed itself. And every single time, it did. What unsettled them most was how instinctively it seemed. Rob would sense the presence of peas even when he had no reason to be suspicious. Situations where he hadn't seen his food prepared, bags he had no cause to search, still, he knew. Eventually, the scientists among them did what scientists always do. They formalized it. They developed hypotheses. They designed controlled tests. Their first assumption was simple: paranoia. Maybe Rob checked everything so habitually that no one noticed anymore. To test this, they observed him closely. When peas were hidden in the food or belongings, Rob detected them without fail. When there was none, he never hesitated. He ate. He reached into his bag, no second thoughts. The pattern held. And then there was the story that turned the whole thing into legend. They called it Parker and the P. One night while the team was out at a restaurant, Rob stepped away to use the washroom, leaving his pint glass unattended at the table. The moment he was gone, the group waved over the waitress and asked her, very seriously, for a single P. It took some convincing before she disappeared in the kitchen and returned with a small cup containing exactly one. They dropped it into Rob's glass and waited. That night, Rob was drinking Guinness, a dark stout with the color of black coffee. There was no chance he could see anything inside it. They sat back, barely containing their laughter, certain this was the one time he wouldn't know. They were wrong. When Rob returned to the table, he didn't touch the glass. He just stared at it. To anyone else, it looked exactly as he had left it. Same level, same phone ring clinging to the inside. Nothing out of place. Then, without a word, Rob picked up a spoon and slowly stirred the drink. Once, twice, he stopped. Rob lifted the spoon from the dark beer, and sitting perfectly in the center of it was the P. The table fell silent. Bill Stone, who was there that night, later joked that if he could isolate whatever mechanism allowed Rob to detect P's, they could all retire wealthy. Whatever it was, it operated well beyond the reach of conventional science. And then, like so many stories about Rob, the moment passed. Laughter returned, life moved on. Now, years later, Rob Parker floated on the surface above the Four Sharks Blue Hole with Duffer and 2 support divers. The sea was calm. The sky was fading into night. They performed their final equipment checks carefully, methodically. For all his hunger for challenge, Rob never cut corners when it came to safety. Every hose, every valve, every gauge checked twice. When everything was ready, Rob raised a clenched fist above the water, then pointed straight down. The others answered with the OK signal. Together, they descended. The plan was simple. All 4 divers would drop to the entrance of the massive cavern, roughly 30 feet below the surface. There, they would cache spare tanks to use later during decompression. At the cavern entrance, they paused. One last exchange of OK signals. Then Rob and Duffer turned towards the darkness ahead and began swimming into the cavern, heading for the distant restriction. Behind them, the 2 support divers remained at the entrance, watching their lights fade as Rob and Duffer disappeared deeper into the Four Sharks Blue Hole. Like many well-known underwater caverns, the entrance to Four Sharks was marked with a permanent guideline. It was a lifeline in the trust sense of the word, showing divers the way in, and far more importantly, the way back out. Rob and Duffer followed that line roughly 300 feet into the cavern, straight toward the back wall, where the cave simply stopped, or at least where it appeared to. At the far end, the rock narrowed into a restriction, and this is where the permanent line ended. No one had ever gone beyond this point, which meant from here on, they would be on their own. Duffer unclipped a reel from his belt and tied its loose end to the final anchor point at the cavern entrance. From that moment forward, every foot they traveled would be marked by a line that they laid themselves. Before entering the restriction, they staged 2 additional tanks for decompression on the return. Then Rob moved into position, leading the way. He compressed his body and slipped through the opening, barely 2 feet wide. To prepare for spaces this tight, both men were diving with open circuit, side-mounted configurations. Instead of carrying their tanks on their backs, they were mounted along their sides, reducing their profile and allowing them to squeeze through narrow passages. Under one arm, each diver carried 2 tanks filled with trimix, a carefully calculated blend of nitrogen, helium, and oxygen. Under the other arm was a tank of compressed air. Every gas had a purpose. Every switch was planned. They would breathe compressed air until roughly 220 feet. Beyond that depth, they would switch to trimix for the remainder of the dive, down to a planned maximum of 250 feet. The reason was nitrogen narcosis. When nitrogen is breathed under pressure, it can produce a narcotic effect, dulling judgment, slowing reaction time, and distorting perception. The condition is temporary and completely reversible, but while it's happening, divers often compare it to intoxication. To explain its severity, divers use a rough guideline known as Martini's Law. For every 33 feet beyond 100 feet of depth, it's said to feel like drinking 1 martini. At 133 feet, 2. At 166 feet, 3. And so on. Experience offers no immunity, and the depth at which narcosis begins can vary widely, not just from diver to diver, but from one day to the next. That uncertainty was exactly why Rob and Duffer planned their gas switches so carefully, because beyond the restriction, there would be no room for impaired judgment. Some divers begin to feel the effects of nitrogen narcosis as shallow as 70 feet. Others won't notice anything until they pass 150. There's no way to predict it, and no way to train it away. Tolerance can't be built. Experience doesn't matter. A diver can feel perfectly clear one day and impaired the next at the same depth. During the previous 2 weeks of filming, Rob and Duffer had routinely descended to nearly 200 feet while breathing compressed air. Trimix was always staged nearby as a precaution, but neither of them had shown any signs of impairment. Dive after dive, they remained clear-headed while beyond the depth where caution usually becomes mandatory. This descent felt no different. As they worked their way through the crack, the passage alternately widened and constricted, opening just enough to breathe, then closing back down to barely 2 feet across. They moved slowly, deliberately, conserving energy and focus. Nothing about the restriction felt unfamiliar. After roughly 30 feet, the rock fell away. The crack opened into a rift. Unlike a restriction, a rift isn't narrow, it's vast. Carved over immense spans of time, it forms a chasm so large it swallows perspective. When Rob and Duffer slipped into it, the sensation was almost disorienting. With the wall behind them as the only point of reference, they floated in open space. Their lights cut weak cones through the water, revealing no ceiling, no floor, no far wall. Just darkness at the edge of visibility. For two cave explorers, this was the reason they were here. They had planned for no more than 20 minutes of exploration before beginning a long ascent. Much of the cave remained unmapped, and no one knew how deep the rift truly went. Rob signaled to Duffer and pointed downward. Duffer answered with an okay. They descended together. At 220 feet, they switched from compressed air to trimix and continued down. Still, there was no bottom. The darkness beneath them refused to give anything back. When they reached their planned maximum depth and saw nothing resembling a floor, they paused. Then Rob signaled to turn the dive. As much as he wanted to find the bottom, discipline won out. They were on schedule. Their gas plan was intact. Everything up to that moment had gone exactly as it should. Routine, controlled, unremarkable, which is often how most dangerous dives begin. Rob began his ascent first. Duffer was about to follow when something went wrong. The regulator on one of his trimix tanks failed. He tried to correct it, adjusted, checked, tried again, nothing. The gas wouldn't flow. With no other option, Duffer switched back to compressed air. At first, he wasn't sure what that meant for him. Neither he nor Rob had experienced any signs of nitrogen narcosis during the dive, even past 250 feet. But the margin between 220 and 250 feet wasn't trivial. It was nearly an entire martini. If Martini's law held, Duffer had effectively gone from sober to 4.5 drinks deep in the span of a few breaths. And that's exactly how it felt. The narcosis hit fast, a sudden rush, heavy and disorienting. Not enough to completely incapacitate him, but enough to make the situation immediately dangerous. Forcing himself to stay calm, Duffer began ascending. With every foot upward, the fog erased. His head cleared just enough to focus on what mattered the most. Rob needed to know. If the narcosis returned, Rob had to be prepared for the possibility that Duffer could become incapacitated without warning. Using hand signals, Duffer tried to explain the regulator failure and the forced switch back to air. Rob responded with signals of his own, but something was off. Neither of them fully understood what the other was trying to say. Still, it seemed to Duffer that Rob had grasped at least part of it, enough to continue. They started back toward the opening that led to the restriction, this time with Duffer in front. It took a moment for the realization to land, a quiet instinct before consciousness thought caught up. Rob wasn't behind him. Duffer snapped his light downward. Below him, Rob was falling. No swimming, no kicking, free falling into the darkness. Duffer immediately reversed direction and dropped after him. Rob was descending fast, pulled down by his gear and the open void beneath him. After chasing him for roughly 30 to 40 feet, Duffer managed to grab hold and arrest the fall. He clutched Rob's left ankle and began towing him upward. As he kicked, a chilling thought surfaced. What if Rob had also been forced to switch back to air? At the same time, in his urgency to pull Rob toward the exit, Duffer began kicking harder, faster, more frantically, and then, as if the situation demanded one more blow, he felt it happen. Both of his flippers tore free from his feet. Now in the open blackness of the rift, Duffer was trying to tow an unconscious diver upward with nothing but his arms while sinking under his own weight, and the exit was still above them. Even without his flippers, Duffer kept moving, kick after kick, drag after drag. He hauled Rob upward until the entrance to the restriction finally came into view, hovering at roughly 170 feet, and then he stopped. For the first time since Rob began falling, reality caught up with him. He had no idea how to get Rob through. The passage was too tight to swim side by side. There was no room to turn around. Towing him backward through a 2-foot crack while swimming in reverse was impossible. Then, against all odds, Rob stirred. Duffer felt movement in his grip. Rob's legs began to kick, weakly at first, then with purpose. When Duffer released his ankle, Rob stabilized immediately, his buoyancy and control returning as if nothing had happened. Relief hit Duffer like a wave. Whatever had gone wrong, Rob was conscious. Rob was alive. Before committing to the passage, Duffer checked his air gauge. 300 psi remained. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't panic-inducing either. They had staged tanks waiting just beyond the restriction. He turned toward the opening and together, they began forcing themselves through. Rob stayed slightly below Duffer as they pulled forward hand over hand. Both men wedged sideways between rock walls, suspended over a black void with no visible bottom beneath them. Inch by inch, they advanced. Eventually, the passage narrowed even further. There was no room left for hesitation. Duffer signaled for Rob to follow directly behind him, then twisted his body and squeezed through the final stretch of the crack. When Duffer emerged into the cavern on the other side, he immediately clipped into one of these staged tanks. This one was filled with nitrox, a higher oxygen mix used to aid decompression during ascent. He took a few deep breaths, then turned back toward the restriction. Rob wasn't there. Duffer swept his light across the opening again. Nothing. No movement, no silhouette, just stone and darkness. Panic surged. He began waving his flashlight violently towards the larger cavern behind him, signaling for help. Eventually, one of the support divers, Tom Liff, reached him. Through frantic hand signals, Duffer explained that Rob had vanished inside the restriction and needed immediate assistance. But Tom was 6'4" and weighed over 200 pounds. He was far too large to safely enter the passage. He was also running low on air, and he didn't have the training or experience to navigate a restriction like that. There was nothing he could do. And worse still, neither could Duffer. Rob Parker was somewhere inside the rock, alone in the dark, and the people closest to him could only wait. Duffer switched to nitrox moments earlier, sealed the situation. Nitrox contains a higher percentage of oxygen than compressed air, and at depth, the oxygen becomes toxic. If Duffer descended back into the restriction while breathing it, the result would have been fatal. Even without that danger, the reality was unforgiving. Entering a 2-foot restriction while wearing 3 tanks and attempting to extract an incapacitated diver was not a rescue, it was a death sentence. So Duffer and Tom had no choice. They left Rob behind and began their ascent. Because of the depth and the duration of the dive, the return to the surface took nearly 3 hours of decompression stops. For Duffer, those hours were torture, suspended in darkness, unable to act, forced to replay every decision while knowing there was nothing left he could do. Just after 2 o'clock in the morning, Duffer and Tom finally surfaced and climbed back into the boat. Duffer gathered the team and told them what had happened. Rob was gone. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the silence broke. One of the support divers began screaming that they should have told her, that she could have gone through the restriction and back out in 15 minutes. That diver was Steffi Swab, the widow of Rob Palmer. To this day, Duffer disagrees. He believes that any attempt to re-enter the restriction that night would have resulted in 2 bodies instead of 1. The tides would not allow another attempt for 2 full days. When the team was finally able to return, they found Rob at a depth of 149 feet. He was wedged in a space less than 2 feet wide. To recover him, they had to remove all of his equipment and let it fall into the darkness below. With it went any chance of knowing exactly what caused him to lose consciousness. A U.S. Coast Guard investigating later concluded that Rob Parker died by drowning brought on by nitrogen narcosis, but how or why the narcosis took hold remains unknown. Rob's body was returned to England, where he was cremated. His ashes were scattered among the caves he loved the most, places he had always been drawn to, places that in the end claimed him.
And that wraps up this episode. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe so we can keep bringing you more creepy, bizarre, and haunting tales. Check out the links below to dive deeper. And if you have your own creepy encounter, tell us in the comments. We might feature it in a future video. Until next time, sleep tight.